So, welcome everybody. Very nice to see you all, those in person and also those online. We're talking today about humanitarian knowledge and danger, addressing the digital infrastructure shortfall. I'm Juliet Parker. I'm the director of ALNAP, which is the learning network for the humanitarian sector. So today we're going to be talking about the critical shortfall in the digital infrastructure that underpins humanitarian research, learning and operations, why this knowledge base is so critical, and also we'll consider how to protect at-risk knowledge systems. I'm going to first hand over to Stephanie to say a few hellos.
Yeah, some hello. Hi, I just wanted to do a quick intro to a project that we're running, which is sort of the inspiration for running this session with ALNAP. So thank you to ALNAP for sort of hosting and running it with us. And from the HCRI, which is the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, which is a research institute at the University of Manchester. And we, last year, along with Bertrand and many other colleagues in the room, launched a project that we've called the Humanitarian Archive Emergency. And we're spending sort of 12 months really sort of digging into this subject. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more about that from our colleagues here. And the project was really the result of collaboration and conversations with a really broad range of organizations and people. So I encouraged those conversations to continue beyond over the next days where we can. And if you are interested in hearing more detail about the actual project, we've left some flyers here and I would be happy to have conversations with anyone. So just an intro and a thank you to Alba. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. First, before we get the discussion going, Abby Stoddard, who is the founding partner of Humanitarian Outcomes and creator of the Aid Worker Security Database. Dr. Uni Karunakara, I hope I've got that right, who's joining us online, who's Senior Fellow at Yale's Global Health Justice Partnership. Christina Villa, Founding Director of Insecurity Insight, and also Professor Bertrand Tate, founding member and former Executive Director of the HCRI, Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. So we're going to start with quite an open round of questions, and I'll start with Abby first, if that's all right. And the question is, how do information infrastructures shape humanitarian action, and can there be a sector without knowledge and learning?
Well, the answer to the second question is no. But I'll be speaking from the standpoint of the two principal databases that we run at Humanitarian Outcomes. So there's the Aid Worker Security Database, which tracks violence against aid workers, and the Global Database of Humanitarian Organizations, which is a compendium of all humanitarian actors in the system and tracks growth in size and operational footprint, size in terms of staffing and budget resources. So these are different from like a program-specific database that would maybe track indicators of where, when, and how to respond to humanitarian emergencies like disease surveillance or famine indicators or sort of program qualitative data on performance. But instead, they provide what we think are very important sort of empirical components to the evidence base on the system. So kind of meta, but also very important, not just for programming, but for policy and advocacy. And importantly, these are not static. It's not something that is produced and then archived and preserved, but their value lies in their continuity and currency, which also makes them vulnerable because they have to be fed and updated and validated daily. And they gain value with the longer they're running because you get the longitudinal depth for your analysis, but again, makes them vulnerable to changes and interruptions. Any gaps and pauses can degrade their value. You realize how few sources like this there are. If they were to go under, you would lose basically a whole empirical sort of set of this is what the system is. So I will stop there now.
Great, thank you very much. Same question to Christina.
Thank you. So we also run a database that does sort of similar things in terms of identifying events that interfere with the delivery of aid. And I couldn't agree more with all the points that Abby has made about the need of continuously updating, because the value in this information is from being up to date, providing information on the changing context. So it doesn't make sense to do it once, archive it, and be done with it, because the point is to understand how the environment evolves. But I think in this panel, the other element I wanted to stress here is that the digital environment today is not just what the aid agencies control and the digital databases they set up. It's also the digital environment in which aid takes place. And I think there's also a lot of information that is actually really important in thinking about how that can be preserved for better understanding of how this affects the aid sector. And what I specifically mean by that is there's all the social media environment out there, and there's all this discussions about how aid is espionage, is around colonialism, there's the lack of trust. And this creates a qualitative assessment of how the digital environment spreads perceptions about aid. And that's also extremely difficult to capture and difficult to preserve, because these posts and comments, they are there, they're gone. And that means this whole contextual understanding in which this environment, or that this contextual understanding of how the aid environment is shaped, is at a perpetual risk of being lost, because we don't even manage to take it all in as it sort of happens across these big digital screens.
Thank you very much. Bertrand.
Thank you. So I'm Bertrand Tate. I'm a historian of humanitarian aid, and I work on research projects on the history of humanitarian aid. And for me, history began yesterday or maybe this morning. So my notion of history is pretty broad, and you'll find on the seats some explanation of what we do in terms of research. But we notably run an archive. Because in many ways, what we think of the humanitarian system is basically only this knowledge economy. And if you remove this knowledge economy, then you have to ask yourself what's left. And the whole concept of a system, which is historically not that old in the humanitarian sector, in 1980s really, emerged in relation to exchange of knowledge and the production of better standards and reflection around standards. Now, the big issue is that archives are not static. They're not dead. They're not buried. They are very much alive. And in the sense that when we talk about the last 25 years, most of this is digital native. So these electronic resources, these infrastructures, are extremely vulnerable to an extent, from a variety of challenges like technical obsolescence, but also from the fact that you can switch them off. And I think we are at a juncture today where we may not only lose the capacity to produce new knowledge and circulate knowledge across the system, but actually lose everything that we've done over the last 25 years, pretty much. And that is a terrifying thing, because then you just wonder, if we lose that knowledge, what are we losing? We're losing not only our understanding of what we've done right or wrong, and the sort of progressive notion of how we might improve on past practice, because that's a very neat sort of concept that we want to carry on working with. I mean, it's absolutely part of the humanitarian endeavor, but we also lose accountability to the people we're meant to help. We also lose an ethical responsibility to those communities, and indeed, we destroy actively or passively their historical records and their sense of identity. So it's an extraordinary moment we're living through. It's not just a little blip in a long phase of crisis. We've encountered many of those in the past. We're actually at a moment in 2025, 2026, where the humanitarian sector is in danger of not only lobotomizing itself, which is indeed what we're talking about, but also attempting to erase an awful lot of its own history, good and bad. And I think that's a fundamental challenge to the ethics of humanity.
Thank you very much. Uni, what can you add?
Yeah, hi everybody. I want to echo what the other speakers have said already. and I speak from my experience with almost 30 years with NSF. Early on, in the early days, data was almost always about effectiveness. So every time we responded to a crisis, there was knowledge that was being generated, what worked, what didn't, who we reached, who we missed, etc. And this was this knowledge was important for the credibility of our action, and also, to measure effectiveness, etc. And we're at risk of losing even that, right? So just to give you some information, MSF is running out of storage space. So SharePoint, which is our internal sort of data management thing, is 86% capacity. And MSF is expected to hit capacity early 2026. I mean, this year, in these few months, we might hit capacity. So 30 years of operational experience is at risk of disappearing. Now, staff spend hours searching for documents, give up, start again, because it's all very badly sort of stored, right? So there's a lot of time wasted, mistakes repeated, etc. So now, one of the discussions within the organization is to deploy automated systems to sort of address this problem, AI, right? So tools will then have decision-making capacity. They'll scan, delete what looks unnecessary, etc. Now, going to what Bertrand said, now what might look unnecessary to an algorithm or AI will probably be essential for a historian, for example, right? So field notes, records in local languages, documentation from conflict zones, because there are biases in algorithms and AI. So these are probably the first things that are going to be deleted. And once they're deleted, they cannot be recovered. So it's not just about operational efficiency, and I want to underline again, it's about preserving our accountability, but also our function as witnessing a lot of what is going on in places where voices and are being deliberately silenced. So we also have that, erasing history and preserving data is one way we can sort of prevent that from happening. So I think within the humanitarian system that Bertrand talked about, there needs to be urgent discussions about how we need some standards on how we preserve information and how we even share information between. I think there are turf issues, and in the past, sharing information has been a problem. And if this project is to succeed and to survive, there has to be a better way to share information. And some smaller organizations are at risk of disappearing as well. So what happens to their information? So these are things we can talk about.
Thank you very much. So we've picked up on some of the issues around the need to preserve information for accountability and ethical reasons, also around effectiveness, also the importance of longitudinal data you picked up, Abby. I was wondering, this recognition that we are at a moment in the sector in so many ways. Abby, how are you finding this kind of moment in the humanitarian sector is impacting on knowledge management functions?
Yeah, I think it's been more difficult than people might know, just to look at things. A lot of the issues are kind of invisible in a way. For our part, we've experienced the impacts of defunding, both with strains on our own data gathering systems, and in the data that we do gather, we're seeing the impacts on organizations, just in terms of losses and closures, et cetera. Starting with sort of the aid worker security database, this is a data stream that relies on several other data streams, some of which, well, a couple of which have weakened or gone dark. So we are trying to shore that up. But this is the fear that these centralized global data sets like ours can look fine and functioning, but might be hollowed out, weakening, less reliable as we lose these kind of feeder streams. Most of our information comes from organizations, and organizations are under real strain right now. For part of the work we're doing for ALNAP's State of the Humanitarian System, we're trying to track the impacts of defunding on organizations. And, with the caveat that it's a small and self-selecting sample, we have about 300 national NGOs that have responded. You're seeing, I think, what everybody kind of intuitively knows to be true, which is that the hardest hit is on the smallest, most frontline organizations. So what we call Tier 7, which are the smallest budget organizations who are most reliant on project-based funding. We've seen an average staff loss of 50%, and so many organizations, very few have actually registered as closed, but quite a number have gone dormant and are only keeping their registrations alive while they seek more funding. So it actually looks better than it appears. And even that, what I'm reporting is a survivorship bias, because these are the organizations that are around to answer and let us know their situation. The organizations that continue to run, as I say, they've had staff losses, but they're also seeing big cuts in beneficiary groups. So one Afghan organization went from 43,000 recipients to 8,000, and that's happening kind of across the board. So as we go, you're going to see fewer organizations with fewer resources helping smaller populations, and that won't be automatically clear unless we have the data to track it.
Thank you. Yeah, as Abby mentioned at ALNAP, we produce the State of the Humanitarian System report every kind of 3 or 4 years, and it's a massive data clip where we work with humanitarian outcomes and others. And one of the conversations I find most interesting as we go through the analysis process is to find out what we can't say. Because either the information doesn't exist, or you can't access it, or people won't share it, or or there's just we don't have the infrastructure to be able to track it. And it's super interesting, kind of going down rabbit holes of trying to find stuff and then finding that it's just not possible. It's really illuminating. Christine, the same question to you. How are you seeing this current moment?
I mean, I can only underline what Abby has said. I think that was a very good description of what is happening within the sector, and we've seen absolutely the same issue. What we have done as a way to address it, or to add another issue there, is that what we've also seen is in this this shrinking space where agencies can work, be it through the funding, but also the political restrictions in so many conflicts, where particular agencies just simply do not have access to vast parts of the affected country. So what we have done to address this information gap is to start developing information systems that go through scraping the information from the affected populations using online sources as a way to supplement what comes through the institutions. And we've done that in particular on looking at violence affecting the health sector, which was done through another project with the University of Manchester. And there it was absolutely striking how over the years, and so this is not something that has just happened now with the USAID cuts. This is also something that has been coming since, I'd say, 2020, since COVID, in a way that agencies just didn't have the same access. So what you're seeing is that there are increasing areas where there's just no information coming from aid agencies because they're simply not present. And then you have these communities that come up with volunteer organizations, or where local partners are working with various structures to the wider humanitarian sector that are doing things and that are also talking about it. But it's not the same way of documenting what is going on in the same systematic manner as the aid agencies are used to do. So we're sort of facing this dual processes of a vastly shifting access environment, as well as a profoundly changing information environment in which information is categorized, shared, and processed. And that is a huge issue for us all to think about, because I think that the points that Abby made, or I think also what was said from the ALNAP report, we are at risk if we don't manage to capture what happens outside the actual humanitarian system of missing a huge part of the story.
Legrand, why does this matter?
Well, I mean, I think we have this project. We have a big coalition called the Humanitarian Archive Emergency, and this coalition includes people around this table. But it also is very concerned with this notion that at a time of crisis, we are increasingly unequal about the preservation of our history and our records. And that means that we're going to find a situation of increased coloniality. We talk about localization, we talk about decolonial approaches, but the reality of it is that the funding cuts hit quite strongly the intelligence sector of the least well-funded. And that, when you've done that, there's no way back. And in a sense, you are literally erasing layers upon layers of information systems, which as they get older, I call archives, but you may want to call them data sets. The point is, you're reaching a point now where by eviscerating these particular layers, you are creating an absence of accountability and an absence of knowledge systems, therefore the incapability of interrogating this material in future. And I think that's what's happening in reality. And we're talking about dormant organization or zombie NGOs, if you want. There is or NGOs whose sphere of activity is reducing so drastically that their identity is at stake. And I think that's a very troubling thing. So we are doing at the moment, we've just launched a major inquiry trying to figure out the scale of the problem and trying to ring alarm bells and try to make sure that some of the learned donors or the donors of research take into account that there won't be research possible when this information system is gone. And the deletion of digital records is easier than the deletion of physical records. Physical records decay, they can be burnt, they can be destroyed, and indeed they are burnt and destroyed in many situations. But the deletion of digital records can be done in a matter of seconds, and can be done as a matter of neglect, just as you know, not necessarily. The politics of neglect are just as important as the politics of intervention.
Thank you very much. Funi, same question to you.
Yes. I just wanted to bring in a perspective from a medical humanitarian organization and the challenges involved in also preserving medical data. So to give you an example, MSF has the largest database of sleeping sickness patients in the world, right? From several countries. And this comes partly because it is a neglected disease, and an organization like MSF and then a few others now work together to collect data, preserve data, and create a database. Here there are questions about whose data is it? There's ongoing conversations between host nations and organizations as to who should be the custodian of that data. So first of all, you have to own the data to be able to, or at least have some sort of ownership over the data to be able to share it. And sharing is another problem altogether. And this is even when resources are available. In 2010 or 2012, NSF came out with an open, data sharing policy. Resources were allocated, and we still don't have a system where data is being processed and managed and shared in a systematic way. This is even when resources are available. So I can imagine the challenges are compounded when resources are dwindling. Another sort of example is sharing knowledge. So till about 20, in the last, before the West Africa Ebola outbreak, there was somewhat a division of labor during an Ebola outbreak. So you will have, for example, WHO in charge of epidemiology. CDC would be in charge of laboratory work. The national government will be in charge of community mobilization. And it was almost always MSF who was in charge of patient management. So that was how it was till 2014. And when 2014 hit, MSF had not shared its knowledge of patient management with other organizations. And we had a huge catastrophe on our hands, and we had to urgently look at how we share information. So this not sort of taking knowledge and data seriously and sharing it appropriately in a timely fashion can have real life and death sort of implications. So I think, and this is just from a medical perspective, and you can imagine what that means. So when we collect data from clinics about women who have been subject to sexual violence, is that medical data? Is that human rights data? And these are all problems that we face on the ground. And I think as a sector, we need to come together and think about these things and sort of work with some sense of urgency to address sort of these concerns so that data can remain, or knowledge can remain uninterrupted and kept for posterity as well.
Thank you very much. So lots of points are being highlighted in what is quite a broad ranging set of discussions, and an opportunity for you to ask your questions or put forward your perspectives. Particularly interested to hear of other people's experiences on vulnerability of information systems and archives, and also what the future might hold in terms of potential. We've got a question online, which I'll also put to the panelists. Are we going to challenge the extractive paradigm on which knowledge management systems are designed? Particularly, whereby is the implementing organization harvesting and collecting often in closed systems rather than having localized sharing? And whose information for whom are we talking about? Yeah, go ahead, John.
I think it's a very interesting point. I mean, I think moving away from an extractive paradigm, which universities partake in, by the way, a lot of academic research is extractive, is one of the fundamental challenges. But the paradox is that we may be throwing the baby with the bathwater by thinking that we can just address this by de-resourcing existing data collection material, when in fact the really heartbreaking thing in my view is that a lot of local actors have been generating records of their own for their own sake to share with their peers in the locality, South-South exchanges. We were in a very interesting moment in terms of the development of knowledge systems and archives by the people, for the people in the most vulnerable places. And we know this because we work with some of those groups in some very endangered places to try to help them build their records. So what's happening is that they're getting hit. And on top of that, all the systems that were supporting them or might engage with them are also being hit. So I think it's there's a lot of false ethical dilemmas that have been presented to us in the recent debates. One of the classic one is this nice to have, intelligence system are nice to have, but really what's important is delivery. And we know that's a false dilemma in the sense that there is no good delivery without good knowledge systems. But another one is to say, well, everything that humanitarianism is about is colonial in nature, and therefore we need to destroy that system in order to build a brand new world. This kind of revolutionary posture. But even very anti-colonial scholars like Achille Mbembe will actually argue that even in the archives of the colony, of the colonial power, you can find the terms of anti-colonial narrative. So in other words, even in the extractive resources, there is the potential to do a critique of extraction. What you cannot do is do a critique of anything if there's nothing left. So I think this is the difference. The situation we are at is really important because of this unique vulnerability of the digital born records. we're in a situation where we're not talking about just shutting the door of the archive, we're talking about burning it down. And I think that's a very different revolutionary act, if you want, than one where you change the name of the sovereign power over the archive. And I think the question was framed in a way that I think ignored this fundamental fact.
Great, thank you. Other reflections from the panelists on this one?
On the extractive nature, it's a good question. The Aid Worker Security Database is an extractive database, and that it pulls information. In terms of security information, it relies on organizations and individuals to report incidents. I think the answer to that is open data. So it can benefit everyone in a locality to be able to see what's happening with their counterparts and neighbors. So that's the idea of situational awareness, is that you know about the incidents that are happening. So we anonymize and protect individual identifying data, but we have our database that's open for anyone to be able to look at and download. So in that way, we consider it a public good that everybody contributes to, but it's remaining extractive. I think ethically, there is an obligation to store and to share accumulated knowledge. And the problem with doing that in the humanitarian sector is the fragmentation. And there's really no locus of accountability for that. So we relearn the same lessons, reinvent the same wheels again and again. I think ALNAP was created to address that particular challenge. So I think the ethics should be more towards, the focus should be on saving and sharing the knowledge, not hoarding it or using it just on certain levels.
Great, thank you. Questions and perspectives from the room? Yes, please go ahead.
Hey, my name is Dennis King. I retired from the State Department as a humanitarian affairs analyst. As Abby and Christine know, one of my jobs was to take data on aid worker security and make products to put in front of decision makers.
Originator of the proto aid worker security database back in the day.
So I was doing that until I retired. Product, an infographic, one-page infographic that would come out for World Humanitarian Day, when maybe decision makers knew that they should pay attention to this. And what decision makers were interested in was basically the trend. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And over the years. And so you could do that with a bar chart. They wanted to know where the attacks were occurring, and you could do that with a color-coded map. And they wanted to know the percentage of aid expats versus local nationals, and you could do that in a pie chart. And then that was sort of the infographic with a little bit of analysis text. But I want to ask Abby and Christine about all of that. Analysis depends on standardization of definitions that have changed over the years. As I know, definitions of methodology, verification of information, disinformation, misinformation. You can't really do a trend analysis unless you sort of have consistent standards over the years. So asking the panel about sort of what they saw as the challenges, either in that particular case or in data sets of using it for analysis, which was what I was interested in, needing it standardized.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so Daniel from Passion, working with geospatial data for disaster response. But my question is more on the tech side, because you talk about the risk of negligence, of organizations shutting down, of funding. But I was wondering about because most of the digital data are stored in servers, cloud services with the Amazons, Google, Microsoft, and all these companies, they are all in the same country. So with all the geopolitical evolution of the tech evolution, do you see this as a risk of having all this data in the same company servers? And are there any solutions that you're thinking about, as other servers, local hard drivers to store it? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you very much. And maybe we come to the challenges of standardization question first. I don't know, Christina, if you want to first comment on that one.
Yeah, no, I think it's exactly as you've outlined it, Dennis. So it's a question of knowing how to bring diverse descriptions into a way that they become standardized and accurately reflect reality in a way that can be used. And this is also an area where I'm currently seeing a lot of skills and competences being lost, because you don't learn that in a day. It takes a lot of experience, and in particular understanding what you do when there are sort of nuances and complexities. And that is a long-term training of the workforce, processes of data quality control that you have to have within an organization. And what we're currently seeing is that with funding cuts, contracts end, and then there are 3 months without anyone with that job description, and then someone new comes in, and then an awful lot of competence in knowing how to classify data carefully is lost. So we're definitely seeing a reduction in quality overall from when it's coming from organizations, which I think is a capacity issue. And on the other last question, just very briefly, we've been instructed by our board that we have to move to safe digital infrastructures, and this is more complex than I anticipated, and it's a real headache, but it is certainly something we are working on, but not easy to do. And then we're also coming back to costs, because it's much more expensive than what we are currently using, and I'm not quite sure who's going to put the bill.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
So just to address the last point a little bit, we are also using proprietary software in many cases, which are hugely expensive. And many of these companies also are now enabling the kind of violence, we read about it in the news. That's another discussion for another time. But we do need to go into a sector-wide standard on how data can be collected and shared. And one way we try to sort of address data, open data, the notion of open data was to publish a lot. And in the last 30 years, we published a lot, but there's still a lot of data that are not easily publishable, but still need to be preserved, right? For various reasons. And there, we started talking about open data, then we ended up at managed data sharing, where we consider, it's not like downloading it from a website, Security Council. Even with anonymization, we need to sort of think about other things when we share information. So all of these steps are quite expensive. And how do you build that into programming, budgeting, making data an integral part? We managed to do that with evaluation at some point. It was quite common for budget proposals to allocate 10% for evaluation or monitoring or whatever. I think we need to do the same with data going forward, because there's no evaluation or monitoring without robust information management. So we need to start thinking about how we can do this all together.
So to answer to your question, sir, I became very alarmed when I was actually writing a lecture for my students, trying to relativize the scale of what was happening in the United States and say, don't worry. And the minute I tried to get data to appear, I got this message from the American administration that this data set has been taken down, that this data set has been taken down. This information is no longer available. I did find it eventually on LinkedIn, and I found a lot of information in the same way. So what we found in our historical work, for example, is that when Somalia went up in flame in the 1990s, archives, libraries were destroyed, willfully destroyed by the warring parties. But some people actually saved stuff, and they saved it on their Dropbox. So there's currently a Dropbox that is the Refugee Health Unit Dropbox for the Somalian government, and it's an 84-year-old who pays a subscription. Now, I forget to pay subscription, and I'm not 84. So very concerned about the fragility of those records. But fundamentally, for me, 2025 was the end of an age of innocence, in the sense that we, for a long time, we actually bought the propaganda. We actually believed in the fundamentally apolitical nature of the liberal digital economy. It turns out it's not apolitical. Surprise, surprise. And maybe this is just the incredible naivety on our part, and on my part, certainly. But the challenge is to the realization that we are incredibly dependent. And when Uni was referring to the fact that MSF is using SharePoint, so is the UC Manchester, by the way, Microsoft product, you're in the hands of an organization that may update its product, not paying attention about the fact that you've got files that are no longer going to be supported by the new version. That's one negligent way of erasing the past, or indeed that they're going to use your data in order to train their AI. And that's something else to think about. So we are in this is a very interesting moment, really, to think about ownership, responsibility, and accountability. And of course, not everything can be shared. You know, the point of an archive is that it contains personal information, contains confidential information, security information, which is not meant to be shared, but needs to be preserved, because otherwise the understanding of the past is going to be extremely difficult and incomplete.
Abby.
So starting with the security and continuity issue, which is really important. In our case, like FuseNet, we were 100% supported by USAID. But unlike FuseNet, we didn't go down when the stop work order came because our site didn't live on the USAID's platforms, right? So we have our database is live on our website, it's built in Drupal, which is open source, and we have our own server. And then of course we back up every day on hard drives. So reasonably secure for that, and it allows us the ability to sort of keep going when a shock like that happens, as long as we can get other funding. In terms of the standardization, I think there's a few important players in the security realm for data that have been cooperating closely, and Christina is one of them, INSO is another, and now UN, DSS, and others have agreed to kind of use these definitions, and we've made it work. But that's about communicating. And
thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
Maybe shifting gears a little bit, but I think that, like many of us, I've been going through this like existential crisis of what AI. I've forgotten about the funding cuts. I'm already like, what is this AI going to do to us? That's an even bigger thing. Oh my God. And I keep like trying, and nobody knows what that's going to look like and how that's going to change all of these problems we have, etc. But I keep imagining this like power dynamic in aid where you have the centralized experts having access to even more data and being able to solve even more problems with it versus local people that have chat AI, whatever, on their phone and are accessing a world of expertise to solve problems themselves instead. And that there's still going to be a power dynamic conflict maybe between them. So I'm just imagining these dynamics. And I guess what I keep coming back to is that where it comes to archives is what these AI, what ChatGPT or whatever is drawing on is really shaping out a lot of the recommendations of learning for the future. And frankly, for most people, practitioners of any shape and size, but particularly people on the ground, they don't have a lot of time to learn or they don't have a lot of time to research and read a lot of documents. And so they will be relying on this. And so I keep thinking about when you were talking about like where these values, like openness of archives, et cetera, And as you guys are thinking about saving archives, but also how do you rebuild something that's more resilient? What does resilience look like in terms of access for these different groups that are basically accessing it through a filter of some sort of AI? And I don't know, that's not an exact question, but I would kind of like your reflection on what that might look like.
On AI, the archives of the ICRC have on their front page, have a statement on AI, because they are getting people asking for documents that simply don't exist, because AI actually hallucinates and produces a range of sources which actually are fake, that are hallucinations, and that are meant or supposed to be archival sources. So just to use the ICRC as an example, you've got this prodigious potential for fraudulent storytelling. And that fraudulency is algorithm based. So it's not without some kind of mechanism within. That's not really an answer, but
No. It's another.
But it's an interesting fact that ICRC felt the need to make that statement.
Thank you. Was there another question?
I had just observation.
Yes, please.
My phone rang, so I'm very disruptive. It's not about AI, so I'd like if the panel wants to talk about AI.
Okay, so we've got the question of AI as the filter through which we're accessing knowledge. There's also some comments online a little bit about where the knowledge comes from. One is from Lloyd about should knowledge management and data not be part of an integrated M&E system? Why do we have these kind of parallel systems that don't seem to speak to each other? Also, another point on the collection of knowledge, where it comes from and who from, and how that becomes more inclusive. Just a reflection I can make from our own ALNAP database. We have the help library, which is 20 or 30,000 pieces of evaluative material. I think, I can't remember the number, but something like 87% of that is English language, which already tells you how not representative that is of the wealth of knowledge of the humanitarian system. But we hold it as a treasured asset for the sector, but know that it's not sufficient in its current form to be appropriate for the future. And also, there's a comment from Basma: data as an open, interoperable, decentralized digital public good is perhaps the natural overhaul to strengthen the digital infrastructure sector. So a range of topics. You're welcome to pick up.
May I say something about?
Yes, sure.
I think the future.
Go ahead.
The future requires data to be triangulated, and how we do that because even elevating local knowledge above sector-wide knowledge is also problematic. I've been to many places where the local knowledge is as sort of erroneous and fake as what AI would throw about, I don't want to use just Israel as a case in point, but the country where I come from in India as well. There's a lot of news that need to be triangulated, and even numbers that need to be really revisited, examined, verified, etc. So I think one of the functions of an archive could also be in the future that it's truthifying or sort of triangulating from various sources. So and of those sources, local sources, of course, have to be included, etc. But I think information is so global nowadays, and even locally, AI is now doing the job of journalists. So a lot of the information we think are local knowledge also need to be verified.
Yes.
Yeah, I can say something to the AI question, because I very much share your sort of preoccupations about how do we adapt to this changing new world. And bearing in mind that what Insecurity Insight does is, like Abby, we are looking at the environment in which aid takes place. So it's not a question of what information do I seek when I have a health problem, but how do we deal with the information that tells us something about access and the acceptance. And so in regards to what do we do with AI in that sort of information space, we have found it absolutely essential to build our own methods, our own algorithms to find the information, because there was nothing out there that could capture the very specific thing we were interested in. And it also meant training it in French and Arabic, because the information is different whether you just get it in English. But it wasn't possible to include Burmese, for example, because the natural language capacity for Burmese simply wasn't good enough to get reliable results. So I think this is also something for the future. So I think it's a question of not passively accepting AI, but to think actively, what can we do to shape these tools that they help us to give us what we need? And it's a massive uphill struggle to do that. But I think one of the other points you made is it is not open, that we actually understand how this information is pulled together. And I think this is also in an area where we need to think what is the right ethical framework in terms of sharing what drives these algorithms. And yeah, so I mean, it's also not just how to preserve the past, but how do we become resilient for the future that is just looking so different.
Yes.
I would just like to say something. We're from UNHCR, and I'm a digital archivist for UNHCR. And I'm not talking about AI. I'm going to talk about some reflections and things for the panel. So we're on the HAE committee, and something I just love this session. It's music to our ears, but not in a good way, let's say, but dystopian way. But something I wanted to say is that the archives and community have gone through this kind of stage of despair. And you see that you're now going through this kind of phase of despair. But I would like to leave kind of some hope on the horizon for the work that we're doing in our teams, for example. And if I go way back to my early career in the humanitarian environment, was in Iraq, where I was working with a formerly displaced person who became the director of the National Library of Iraq. And they were rebuilding the library with digital surrogates, but he was committed and communicated to me the importance of memory in relation to the humanitarian context. And he kind of pulled me out of my cave in the University of London and put me into the UNHCR, and I landed there, setting up the Digital Preservation Service with my colleagues. We were all working in different mandates here, but in records and archives. And just so convinced about the importance of it, that it's not a nice to have, as Bertrand said, or it's so essential. And that the risks that you're talking about, such as orphan projects, orphan data sets, multi-partner projects where data gets lost, there are solutions for these things. Technology exists for these things. We need resources. I know that there's been an impact on the cuts on all of this, but there are solutions. And I think that's all I really wanted to say. Solutions exist. There was maybe one more thing, Heather. Anything else you want to say?
Other than that, it's an ecosystem, and we can see certainly within our context at UNHCR, which is a very large humanitarian organization compared to some of the NGOs that the project is looking at, but we've been forced to take some difficult choices as to where we focus what remains of the resources. And if it's happening in UNHCR, it's absolutely happening elsewhere. So, for example, one of the consequences is that basically historical research has had its oxygen starved from the room, because we are focusing all of our resources on saving this digital record that Bertrand was talking about, this 25-year digital born. That's become suddenly very much at risk because the technological basis on which it rests is very much threatened. So there is a need for this kind of coalition thinking, whereby we think of not just the data being the tree on which the fruit hangs, but the oxygen in the air, the nutrients in the soil. We work in this sector together between the research community, the humanitarian sector, and the emergency response sector.
We like to think of it as a tree, with the roots, and the tree needs to be taken care of to grow. But also, the last thing I want to say is that digital preservation and storage is not digital preservation. Storage is just one branch of it. We need processes and mechanisms to ensure the data has integrity and over time. So while we're worried about big tech, and we have been speaking about this, and vendor lock-in, it's not just, that's a bit gloomy, but it's not just about storage. We need other mechanisms as well to ensure this ecosystem survives. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertrand, you had your hand.
Yeah, and I don't think we're ringing the bell of despair. But we're ringing an alarm bell for sure, because at the moment when people are talking about reset, you need to be, I mean, it's a bit geeky, but you don't want it to end up with a control or delete sort of moment, you know. And I think this is what we're facing, is that in order to make savings and to reprioritize or to focus on core mission, the fundamentals of reasoned and thoughtful action may be lost in the process. And I think that's really a great deal of what is at risk now. And I think partly because it's such a fragmented sector, and the knowledge economy has grown fairly organically with all the unevenness and all the power relations of north-south and money and all these issues. But the ethical issues that are at the heart of them are absolutely fundamental to the definition of what humanitarianism is about.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, the importance of memory. I have to say, since working at ALNAP, I've realized just how short humanitarian memory is. It's even shorter than I'd anticipated. And also how little time there is in most parts of the sector to sit back and access that memory within our kind of model. And the issue of resourcing, I mean, how to make sure that this kind of preservation of knowledge and protection of knowledge and what we already know is recognized within the almighty challenges of prioritization at the moment is super interesting. There's a comment online from Sebastian, which he emphasizes is his assumption, and based on experience, not studies, is how can we get organizations to understand that it's cheaper and more effective in the long run to hire proper full stack developers and database managers that do actually manage databases, not just Excel spreadsheets, instead of buying yet another off-the-shelf solution from tech service providers over which the organizations do not have full control in the end. And you've got your hand up as well.
Not necessarily to respond to this question, even though it's also an interesting question, because we actually have an off-the-shelf solution for collective intelligence in the sector, and we're working with AI. So a lot to speak there. Maybe to this question, sure. I think a lot of times what we've seen is that organizations invest a lot of time into developing their own solutions. They spend a lot of time and money in doing so, but they don't function as startups. And so they don't function with quick build, implement, learn, and improve cycles, which often leads to this kind of 20-year-ago approach of software development, that they develop a huge knowledge management solution, they launch it, and then nobody uses it. And that, yeah, in the end, then wastes again a lot of money and time. So I think there is a sort of balance there, that you can work with off-the-shelf solutions because they've already done a lot of the groundwork, but then work with them to actually see how it can work in your own context, and that you will from there further. That's what we do, at least, so that we still have the opportunity to work with organizations to see, okay, what are their workflows actually like? How can we adapt and improve our solution to fit that context? And just to speak to some of the points before, I also agree that we have a huge opportunity right now, despite everything that's happening now. We're at a point where, for the first time, we're able to build on so much qualitative data in ways that we weren't before. And obviously, we have to be conscious. We shouldn't feed all our data to a chatbot that has contracts with the Ministry of War in the US. That's not a good idea. So conscious choices about where our servers, they're great European servers, there's great European AI, there are more transparent providers, or even developing your own LLM. So there are definitely ways to do this. We're building your own AI agents to read through your SharePoint database, but just be conscious about your choices. And then you have such a huge opportunity to democratize knowledge also, and take away or circumvent the gatekeepers that you had before, where before it was some evaluation report would come out and there were people who decide who gets access to this data. But with databases where you can actually make it possible for everyone, local level, regional level, headquarter level, to feed in knowledge, experiences, qualitative data, and then make it possible for everyone to access that and actually just query it in a way that they need at that moment, built on ethical and responsible AI models, you have an immense amount of knowledge that you didn't have before and patterns that you couldn't see before. So hopeful as well.
Great, thank you. Responses on any of those from the panel?
Maybe just more thoughts on the AI. We used to think that it was enough to provide open data and to have it existing online so that people can go and use it. The issue of filters is something that we've been grappling with. Originally, HDX came along. It's actually to compile all data sets from across the sector. But we found more people were going to HDX than to the original source for things. With AI, it's going to be a query through the chatbot, and then it will be, it's recursive, right? So then it's going to bring up other results of queries from chatbots, and you're getting further and further away from the actual original data. So I think the answer to that is what our colleague was just saying: build your own agents to help, and be more, I guess, be more assertive about saying that this is what the data is saying, this is what we think the data is saying, and pushing that out as opposed to just, building it and letting people come.
I mean, I think one of the issue that we face in our ecosystem is that the qualitative nature of the data has also changed, and you see it very easily in the records of humanitarian actors. The production of field reports, the production of accounts of experiences is much terser, is less informative very often, or is on platforms which are very unstable, of short-lived WhatsApps or whatever. So the preservation of the digital record on which you may want to build AI learning models, it is in itself a problem. So I think the foundations at the moment are not very secure. And I think we go back to this issue of digital preservation and some real challenges about the curation of that information. That is, you cannot build AI systems on a void. Yeah, you have to have decent, and I think that's the foundations are not secure. I think this is a moment where we need to think about the foundation of that model. Now, I think that I agree with you. There is genuine potential to then do very interesting things with it, with this information, and democratize it, keeping in mind Uni's point that information that's not triangulated, where you don't have a multitude of viewpoints, is not information you can rely on.
Bertrand,
Oh, sorry. Uni, go ahead. You wanted to respond.
Just keep in mind that many agencies are writing strategy documents and reports now using AI. So that's probably explains the qualitative nature, that you pointed out of humanitarian reporting, because they use the same tools to generate these reports that you want to preserve. So that's another sort of issue that needs to be addressed. I know several instances where this has been the case, and the reports had to be sent back to be rewritten because hallucinating AI and references that were not really could not be found, etc. So there is that as well, that when resources are not that much, then agencies will resort to automation tools to generate reports, generate the kind of information they need to put out to secure funding, etc. So that's another level of problem that we need to acknowledge and to address.
Thank you. Yes, at the back.
Yeah, I have a question regarding to, because I think while we're talking about preservation of knowledge, it's also important to acknowledge that there is so much knowledge that's been generated, right? Like all the organizations, they invest in research and evidence building, and there is just the amount of knowledge is overwhelming, and oftentimes it's not been used as it intended, right? Because it just sits in repositories, and there are examples where organization produces a report and there are a handful of views of this report, in the end. And I think so my question maybe is, now that we're talking about preservation of this knowledge, what kind of approaches and criteria and maybe standards your organizations use for to decide what knowledge is worth preserving, what kind of what approaches are used for quality assurance and information integrity and so on. And also, how do we preserve knowledge in a way that kind of facilitates the use of this knowledge and makes it not just knowledge for the sake knowledge for the sake of knowledge, or for the kind of sake of keeping an archive, but actually kind of makes use of this knowledge and helps practitioners maybe use it better in their work.
Oh, I love that. What knowledge is worth preserving? I imagine lots of archivists have opinions on that one. Go ahead.
When fundamentally, any preservation means curating. So curating means triage. So not everything can be preserved. Now, the way historically archives have been preserved is by accident. So archivists have this phrase, natural archives, things that haven't been burnt, things that haven't been stolen, things that ended up in the right place, and things that weren't actually stolen by a minister, for example, to sell it late, like Winston Churchill did. So that sort of approach was the natural way of doing things in the past. An archive is never designed for researchers. It's designed for the people who run an organization originally. Now, of course, that is we're in a very different world, because we are generating, just check your phone, you've got probably thousands and thousands of pages of random chats and YouTube and all sorts of rubbish, that is capturing the memory of your single device. Multiply that by 7 or 9 billion, and you end up with the state of the information overload that we all have. In truth, there is going to be a need for triage. The question is, who is going to be in charge of the triage, and what kind of political choices will the triage reflect? That's the fundamental question we should ask ourselves. Not that triage will happen or not. Triage will happen. But the question is, who is going to do the triage on what basis? And when you ask that question, then you're asking a fundamentally political question about the nature of the new forms of power that are at stake. So neglect is a form of violence. I think it's a very profound form of systemic violence. And I would argue that in colonialism, one of the greatest forms of violence was neglect. And if you look at I've got a classic story to say. I went to the archive in Dakar, colonial archives, great famine in 1913. The only reference I found in the archives to this famine that killed, according to the observers at the time, 1/3 of the population was the taxes are going to be hard to bring in this year. That's the only thing I found in the report, because that's the ultimate form of the expression of violent neglect. And I think we are in danger of replicating that kind of violent neglect by authorizing machines, but machines are never machines by themselves, machines and people, to actually exercise that triage on our behalf. So that's the challenge that we're facing today. So taking ownership of our data, taking ownership of and giving back ownership of the data to the people to whom it belonged in the first place, the communities with which humanitarians act and work, is at the heart of this debate.
Great. I'm going to come to each of the panelists for the big fat so what from all of this.
I think I've just said that.
We've talked quite a lot about the knowledge that is coming in. Where's the knowledge coming from? Who does it represent? And then there's the triaging process, and there's the preservation and protection and storage process, and then there's the utilizing and accessing process. And on all of that, we've recognized this fragility of what we've inherited and where we're at. and this intention that has to be behind, to steal a phrase from the previous session I was in, how do we stabilize and renew? Stabilize and protect whilst recognizing that what we have is also not where we need to be next. And this opportunity, this kind of junction moment for renewal, and where does that sit in terms of our responsibilities and the potential and vulnerabilities for the future? Oh, Abby, do you want to go first?
Sure.
The big fat so what?
Well, it's a big challenge because the donor that provided a third of the resources to the humanitarian sector is no longer doing so. That donor was also outsized in its funding of this type of work, of data systems, of enablers in general. So it's very hard, but I think we have a lot more existing in informal archives now in the humanitarian system than we're using, and which could, with coordination and with a deliberate effort, could be made into something much better than what we have now. And I mean, my sort of dream would be to have like a PubMed for humanitarian evaluations, just as an example. You can look up something and they are standardized and they are weighted by their quality, and you can find out the lessons learned from so many other projects in a specific area. And that would be a digital resource available to everyone. So I think the substance of that is there. It just has to be brought together and curated. So yeah. We just need people like University of Manchester, Humanitarian Archive Emergency to find the resources and
Christina.
I think we have to face it that we are living through a fundamentally transformative moment in terms of information management, for lack of a better word. And this, I think, has profound impacts of how we preserve what we had in the past, but we also need to think what we do in capturing the right information going forward. And this is very, very challenging. I mean, as Abby said, we are facing a big challenge in terms of where the funding for the sector is coming from. But we have to not forget the broader context in which all of this is happening. And the last point I would underline there is that there is also an increasing challenge to the formalized humanitarian system, and it's getting much more diverse with diaspora groups and other volunteer groups. And we need to think of how we can bring in the information that comes from these initiatives into the broader understanding and the learning, as Abby said, that really there's learning and taking the information to get better at preserving humanity and addressing basic needs continues. But we need to adapt to do this.
So to add to this, I think reasons to be hopeful. I mean, I think there are some reasons to be hopeful. And one of them is that you see it in, there are people who are doing this work, who are saving the records of their communities in places like Myanmar, like in places like the state of Manipur in India, which is under constant violence. And they are making a fundamental effort, and they need help, and they need structure. So on the one hand, we need to preserve what we have, because what we're in danger of losing is not our to lose fundamentally. But on the other hand, we also need to find ways of disseminating best practice, ways of doing, and thinking through how we do things. And I think that's the key effort. Now, everybody is going through major cuts, and we are not in a. This is a bigger story than just the humanitarian sector. We could be having the same conversation in a climate change scientific gathering, or indeed a gender studies scientific gathering, or a number of other cultural wars that have been waged. So acts of erasure are political. You have to take a political stance, which I know is not neutral or impartial. There you go. Not time that way. Winnie.
Yeah, there's more information than ever before at any point in the last 30 years that I've been a humanitarian worker. But the challenge, of course, is what is noise and what is knowledge. And there is no credible, responsible humanitarian action without that knowledge. We have incredible amount of experience that we have gathered over the last 50 to 30 years. And then, that we need to use, we need to preserve. And a point that Bertrand made earlier, that there is the humanitarian system, that there is also so much knowledge outside of what we consider to be the humanitarian system, which provide assistance on a daily basis, which is not. So, for example, a lot of the aid and funding that the Chinese government gives to national governments for disaster preparedness, etc., is not really included in what we consider to be a humanitarian system knowledge. So there is knowledge that we have access to, but there's also much more out there we need to consciously consider and bring in. But the fact remains that we need this knowledge to keep humanitarian action relevant going forward.
Thank you very much. Yeah, what is noise and what is knowledge? I'm going to be using that phrase a few times, not least with my teenagers. Thank you, everybody, very much. Thank you very much to the panelists, also to the people in the room and the people online. Lots of interesting comments and questions, which I hope I've managed to feed into the conversation. Please do keep in touch. It's such a live discussion at this moment, and we have such a responsibility. Please do reach out to Bertrand and Stephanie if you're interested, and grab
one of those leaflets.
Also, please do check out #NewLearningLandscapes, ALNAP's campaign, where we are trying to create a space to continue these conversations. So do please follow and comment there as well. Thank you very much. We're finishing 15 minutes early, so you're also welcome to stay and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.